my guest today, wrote a book. His most recent book, Birthright, talks about the dragon. And I'm looking forward to talking to him. Let's bring on the author, Timothy Alberino. Hello, sir. How are you?
Very nice to be with you. I'm doing well.
Your book is incredible. I'm going through it right now, Birthright. I got to shout out my friend Wesley Roth for giving it to me. He speaks highly of you, and I'm very glad that he connected us. But it's interesting that this whole dragon phenomenon, obviously you have a different take, a very specific take on that. So I'm hoping you can kind of walk us through what you mean by the dragon.
Okay. Well, the dragon is an appellation that's used for a very specific character in the biblical text. So when I write about the dragon in my book Birthright, I'm referencing this personage, again, who is called the dragon. Now, that's not his name, and he's not called that because he's an actual dragon. He's not serpentine in his appearance. Rather, the idea of a dragon, a creature being fierce, and also being connected to a serpent, being cunning, these are attributes that define him. And of course, this is the Satan, the adversary. Some people call him Lucifer, and that is the dragon of biblical fame.
Can you walk us through?
He is the dragon.
Can you walk us through why you chose to use that as the terminology in the book?
So it's interesting when you read the biblical narrative, this character, again, who is infamous, this most infamous character of all characters in the biblical narrative is never actually named. He doesn't have a name. Some people call him Lucifer, but the name Lucifer is actually a misnomer derived from Jerome's Vulgate. And so his name isn't Lucifer, but this character was involved in, depending on how you view the biblical narrative, was involved in a momentous event that changed the course of history. I think both for what I call the elder race, which would be the angelic race, and certainly for the human race, the human species. And this was, of course, this event was a insurrection, a rebellion against the kingdom of heaven, which I believe, from my perspective, took place a very long time ago in a pre-adamic context. In other words, before the creation of Adam.
So you write about this time existing before the creation of man. And you talk about the galactic war. I think you say the threads of the galactic war still reverberate through our world today. So we'll come back to the dragon, the Satan character, because he obviously plays into this war. Can you try to tell listeners what you mean by the galactic war, maybe where you are pulling from to write about the galactic war?
Well, the conventional perspective of the biblical narrative is a perspective called an anthropocentric perspective, a perspective that centers around mankind. That's what anthropocentric means, man-centered or human-centric. And from that perspective, mankind is at the center of all things. Everything began, the creation of mankind was at the beginning of the story. So our story started in chapter 1, so to speak. And everything that unfolds in the biblical narrative happens thereafter. And I happen to think that that is incorrect. I come from a different perspective, which I think is actually the accurate biblical perspective, the correct biblical perspective, which is a Christocentric perspective that places Christ at the center of the universe. It is his story. He is the hub of the wheel, so to speak, and we are ancillary characters in his story, and that the appearance of mankind on the scene, in other words, when you open up the beginning of the Bible, the book of Genesis, our chapter is not chapter 1.
Right.
We come into the story much later on, and there are many things that occurred previous to our existence in the universe. So there's this long untold eons of history behind us. And I believe that you can trace this thread through the biblical narrative, and part of that history a large part of the history that I think is apparent, although inconspicuous in the scriptures, in the Hebrew Old Testament primarily, in the Hebrew Bible primarily, is this idea, this narrative of a galactic war, a cosmic conflict that erupted, certainly in our solar system, long before the creation of mankind. And it led to all kinds of cataclysmic fallout in the, as I said, in the solar system and on the planets in our solar system, including the Earth. And so when you begin the story, when you open up Genesis, you're looking at planet Earth in a condition post-cataclysm. So something happened, and then there is a decision made to reform the Earth. So I think what we see in the beginning of the book of Genesis is a reformation of planet Earth and the institution of a new governor, a new vice regent on planet Earth, namely Adam, the human species, the father of our species. And again, our story, which begins with Adam, is not chapter 1. And so this opens up a whole potential scenario that is, I believe, there's intimations of this pre-Adamic scenario woven throughout the oracles of the prophets in the Old Testament and the Psalms and the Proverbs. And it's not conspicuous, it's inconspicuous, it's hidden. And people might wonder why the details of such an extraordinary event would be hidden. Well, we're kind of told why that is by Solomon in the book of Proverbs, who said that it is the glory of God to conceal a matter, but the glory of kings to search out a matter. So God is in the business of esotericism, of hiding things, and things that must be uncovered by the wise. And I think that, again, this pre-Adamic history conflict, this galactic conflict, which, by the way, includes, in my opinion, the obliteration of a planet or planetoid that once existed between Mars and Jupiter, which is now a asteroid belt.
Right. Where did you first start to see evidence of this for your theory? Like, were you looking at the hidden parts within the Bible and then expanding from there? Or were you looking at Apocrypha? Where did it start?
Well, this is, I've picked up on some of this throughout my life when I was younger, but it really, I would say that there was a particular moment when it dawned on me, when I had kind of an epiphany of the things I'm talking about, and that was when I was reading a book called Sidonia, The Secret Chronicles of Mars by the late David Flynn. David was an extraordinary researcher, and so the seeds of the idea were in my mind because I've been reading the Bible ever since I was a child. And some of these things were occurring to me organically from the text. And then when I read David Flynn's book, it was as I said, it was something of an epiphany.
When about was that? Like when you started reading the Bible at a young age, you're starting, you're learning. I didn't read it till much later. But when did you start to think like, hey, I'm seeing things in here that maybe other people aren't seeing?
Well, I guess I've kind of always had perspectives that were not in vogue, let's say, in regard to the Bible. Mm-hmm. When I was 18 years old, I dropped out of high school. I moved to the Amazon jungle, and I lived in Peru, in the jungles of Peru. I like to think for my formative years. And it was during that period of time that I would say that certainly the primary ideas that I set forth in my book Birthright began to concretize in my mind, and it was after that I lived in Peru for about a decade, and then I came back to the United States. And when I came back to the United States, that's when I encountered the work of David Flynn and others, mm-hmm. and I was able to start to put these pieces together in a coherent way, let's say.
Right.
And so it's really been a journey for me, and my perspectives are always evolving.
Yeah.
And I'm very open to all kinds of ideas about many things, not just about the biblical content, but also in regard to the biblical narrative. I'm just always open to modifying my position and learning more. I would not consider myself a fundamentalist, and so I'm looking for truth. And in this pursuit of truth, these things became apparent to me.
I think that's fair. You know, have only been baptized for 2 years now, and I'm still very new to all of this, but read the Bible a lot now, more so than I have my whole life. But there's still, it's like, I think it's okay to remain skeptical of the things you're being told through different, whether it's different translations you're reading or what's been left out. And a lot of people I find get offended if you happen to have questions, or if you even want to extend the timeline of Earth as you have. What kind of arguments do you hear from other biblical scholars when they hear you talk about the pre-adamic age?
Well, I would say that the majority of scholarship holds a traditional view that when you engage with First Genesis, what you're looking at when you open up your Bible at First Genesis and you start to read, you're looking at the beginning of the universe, shortly followed thereafter by the beginning of planet Earth and the creation of mankind. And that's probably the prevailing view, although there are scholars and theologians out there who would argue, and they're growing, I would say, this camp is growing, who would argue that actually that's not necessarily the case, that we may be looking at, as I said earlier, a reformation of the earth, and there may be vast periods of time here involved at the beginning of Genesis before the creation of mankind. There's a particular theory that is sometimes referred to as the gap theory, that says that there's a gap between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Right. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, period. Mm-hmm. There would be a period of time there, an unspoken period of time between that statement and the following one, and the earth became desolate and empty, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. So in other words, in the beginning, God created everything. He created the earth, and then something happened that caused the earth to be in a state of bleak ruination before the creation of mankind. And then what we're seeing is the reformation of the earth. And again, the installation of a new governor in this realm, of a new vice regent who's going to govern this realm that's being rejuvenated and reformed, and that would be, of course, Adam, because Adam was created to be a son of God.
Right.
If you read the genealogy of Jesus of Nazareth, it goes all the way back through his genealogy, all the way to Adam, the son of God.
Right.
And so I believe that, and I break this down in my book Birthright, but I believe that our Genesis is much more magnificent than what we have hitherto countenanced. I believe that mankind was created to be a member in the divine family, in the family of God, and that we have older siblings. There are older siblings in this family who look like us, or rather, who we look like, and that this would be that angelic race, who I denominate as the elder race in my book. And I call them the elder race because they're never directly categorized or named outside of the word angel or angelic. And the word angel is nondescript. It's simply a description of occupation rather than of nature or kind.
Right.
It simply means messengers. Malak in the Hebrew and angelos in the Greek, it just means a messenger, one who is sent, an envoy. But clearly in the biblical narrative, we have these non-human, extraterrestrial beings who are in play. And they're coming from somewhere that's not planet Earth. Indeed, their primal origin is not planet Earth. And that's why I argue in the beginning of my book that the angels encountered in the biblical narrative are extraterrestrial beings. There's no way around it, because extraterrestrial simply means a being whose origin or provenance is not planet Earth.
Right.
And these angelic beings, and that we are encountering in the narrative, in the biblical narrative. In other words, the characters in the story are encountering these beings, these angels. They are not from the earth. And we know they're not from the earth because in the book of Job we read that God is laying the foundations of the earth, and as he's doing this, the morning stars are singing together. And morning star is an epithet for this angelic race. The morning stars are singing together, and all the sons of God are shouting for joy. This isn't a pre-Adamic context. The human species does not yet exist in this scenario.
Right.
And yet you have these sentient beings who indeed the earth is being created, so they're not from the earth. You have these sentient beings who pre-exist mankind and who are not from planet Earth. How else should we describe them if not extraterrestrial?
Right. I love the way you describe it in the book about how they would, describe what they see as a chariot, but that's because that's the best technology they had in their day.
Right. So you have these beings, these angelic beings, again, who I denominate as the elder race. You have the members of the elder race when they're dispatched to the earth to deliver a message or to interact with human beings. And again, this is within the context of the biblical narrative. In several cases, you have them arriving at the helms of what I would describe as advanced aerospace vehicles.
Right.
They're arriving at the helms of vehicles of conveyance. These vehicles of conveyance are described variously in the biblical text as the chariots of God, the chariots of Israel, and they're described as of chariot of fire. That's it. I mean, that's the only description you get. You don't get a more meticulous or detailed description of the vehicle. You just are told that these extraterrestrial angelic envoys are flying around in something.
Right.
And these Bronze Age people are describing that something in the best way that they know how, because the most advanced vehicle of conveyance during that period of time was a chariot.
Right.
And a chariot had wheels, and it had bronze, and it was, it had horses, because people in the Bronze Age could not conceive of a horseless chariot. That was not a thing. Right. You had to have some kind of a beast of burden pulling the chariot in order to make it move. So it makes sense that they would describe something, let's say an advanced piece of technology, an advanced piece of aerospace technology, as a chariot. But I don't believe that as modern readers of the Bible that we are constrained to read the text as the people in the Bronze Age.
Right.
We know that horses don't fly. I mean, we learn that Santa Claus isn't real when we're kids, and this usually comes upon the realization that reindeer don't fly either. And sleds aren't made to traverse the heavens, only the snow. They're only made for snow. And these sort of obvious observations are quickly noted by us in our youth, and the idea of Santa Claus is discarded because it's illogical. The same thing, I think we can do the same thing. I think we're entitled to do the same thing when we look at something like a chariot of God, which is the chariot of God and its horsemen. Well, we're not looking at flying horses. Horses don't fly any more than reindeer fly.
Right.
That is a fact, and we don't have to pretend that it's not. And so when I approach, and I take the biblical text seriously for many reasons, because many people will say, well, the whole thing's a fairy tale. Well, that's not actually true. I believe that the Bible is the most remarkable, it's really a compilation of books, the most remarkable compilation of books ever written or compiled, and there's many, many reasons why I say that. It distinguishes itself from all other ancient texts in many ways, not the least of which is prophecy, things that are predicted about the future which come to pass with 100% accuracy. That's one of the indications that this is, in fact, what the late Chuck Missler used to describe as a integrated message system from outside of time.
Oh, that's good. That's great. Yeah, people were projecting onto the things that were mysterious to them to the best of their ability because of what was surrounding them. And I think, do you think that's happening today when people see things in the sky they can't explain? You know, we've got supposed UFOs, UAPs happening, and we see them as saucers or possible Lockheed Martin technology. But you think there's something else beyond that we're just not comprehending that is part of the supernatural world?
I think that what we're looking at in regard to UAPs, it's two things. Well, it's three things. Let's begin with the obvious. Many of the sightings that people have conventional explanations.
Right.
They see things, all kinds of different phenomena in the sky, sometimes flocks of birds, sometimes various kinds of aircraft that are flying around at the distance that might look like something else. So a lot of the sightings that people have are not just have conventional explanations.
For sure.
That leaves us with two other categories. We have craft that are of human origin and then craft that are of non-human origin. The craft that would be of human origin, so we're talking about advanced aerospace vehicles that are capable of extraordinary feats, not your normal jet flying in the sky or even one of our advanced fighter jets. We're talking about something that can make sharp right-angle turns at high rates of speed, that can disappear, that can, again, do things that conventional aeronautics does not allow for. Mm-hmm. We have craft like that we have, I think the United States government, probably the Chinese, probably the Russians, have developed advanced aerospace vehicles that are far more advanced than I think that the public is aware. Maybe 100 years more advanced than the conventional aircraft that we're all aware of. And so those are, sometimes I think that's in play, and people see those let's say classified aircraft, but that doesn't explain all of the phenomenon. Mm-hmm. And it's very simple to deduce that scenario, the human tech cannot explain the entirety of the phenomenon, because the phenomenon was happening before we had our own aircraft, right. Before it was happening in World War II, for example, and previous to World War II, before we had the technology to build the kind of advanced stuff we build today. And it was happening even in certainly at the turn of the 19th century. And earlier, I think that especially the saucer-type craft have been in our skies since our inception, since Genesis 1, in other words. Because as we were alluding to earlier, I believe that this angelic race, the elder race, that they are using advanced aerospace vehicles. In other words, I don't think it's far-fetched to propose that this angelic race, that they themselves are at the helms of some of these saucer craft.
Right.
And in fact, I believe that personally very strongly. I have good reason to believe it. So
why?
But the phenomenon has been around for a long time. That's why a very simplistic explanation that this is human-made technology, we've developed this technology over the decades, it falls short because it does not account for the totality of the phenomenon as seen over many centuries.
Why do you have that belief that you were just alluding to?
Well, first and foremost, there's anecdotal experiences that friends of mine have had. Mm-hmm. That seem to indicate that there's an angelic component to some of this. Now, it's important to understand that when we talk about the elder race, this angelic faction, that you have, according to the biblical account, you have both the good guys and the bad guys, so to speak. You have those who are still loyal to the kingdom of heaven, mm-hmm. and those who are in a state of rebellion and insurrection and apostasy, the quote-unquote fallen angels. That's actually not a biblical term, fallen angel, but it's a biblical idea.
Right.
And it really, to be more accurate, I think we can be more accurate by describing this faction as apostate sons of God. These are the apostate sons of God who are here with us, interacting with us. And I think that, this is a very exceedingly ancient and technologically advanced civilization. And so the good guys and the bad guys would be just as advanced, and they would be using the same kind of technology, certainly would have a knowledge of the same kind of physics.
Right.
And so we could be encountering and have been encountering potentially for many thousands of years, again, going all the way back to the inception of the human species on planet Earth, we could have been encountering and are still encountering these guys, this faction, this group, the elder race, good and bad, loyal and disloyal, and they would be using the same kind of technology. And I think it would be this saucer type technology, not just the saucers, but most of us are familiar with the saucer craft, the flying saucer model, let's call it. And I have no reason to. I think that there's no reason to reject such a proposition. I mean, if this angelic race is in fact exceedingly ancient, they are. We know from the biblical text that mankind was created to be a little lower than the angels. That these beings are, not only do they pre-exist us, but that they are, that they have more extraordinary capabilities than we do. Biologically speaking, they're more intelligent than we are.
Right.
They know more about the universe than we do. Their understanding of physics would be far more advanced than ours. And there's no reason to think that they would not be operating this advanced technology. And people's, of course, when I say things like this, I ignite a whole lot of contention and questions, because a lot of people are coming from a perspective, a lot of people in the Christian community are coming from the perspective that all of that content dealing with angels and the kingdom of heaven is all supernatural.
Right.
But the problem with the word supernatural is it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't have any explanatory power whatsoever. The word supernaturalis comes from the Latin. It's not a biblical term. It's a term that we impose on the Bible. It's a term that basically is used to describe anything that we don't understand.
Yeah.
But I contend that if you have an alleged supernatural occurrence, if you can understand the mechanisms behind that occurrence, it's no longer super, it's just now natural.
Right.
Totally. If you can explain it, if you have enough knowledge about the physics of the material world, it can probably be explained by those laws and through the development of technology associated with that understanding of physics. So what I'm saying is, I don't believe I believe fundamentally, from my point of view, there's only one truly supernatural being, and that is God himself.
For sure. I agree. Do you think... oh, sorry, continue.
I would just say everything else in the universe is constrained by the same laws of physics.
For sure. When it comes to the crafts you're talking about, do you think, is it the seraphim that's the wheel within the wheel? Was it Ezekiel who saw that? Like, was that something you would consider as one of those crafts?
No, I wouldn't. And the reason why I wouldn't is because I'm very careful to delineate between prophetic iconography, in other words, things that are seen in the context of a dream state or vision,
okay,
from the actual historical narrative of the text. So you have a lot of the Old Testament. Much of the Old Testament is describing things that are seen in a visionary experience. I mean, that's the nature of prophecy. So a prophet, and that's what Ezekiel is writing about. Ezekiel is either having in that, and I don't know if in that particular case if it's a vision, right, or if it's a dream.
Right.
But it's going to be one of those two things when you read the prophets, the experiences of the prophets in the Old Testament. Even if you go back to the extra biblical text, for example, the Book of Enoch, these guys are having dreams or they're having visions. In other words, if you were to approach one of these prophets, let's say Ezekiel, and he's having one of these visionary experiences, he's awake, but he's having a visionary experience, you could go up and interact with him. You could touch him. He hasn't gone anywhere.
Right.
He's still there. In other words, what's happening is his perception is being hijacked.
Yep.
And he's getting a download of information in the form of symbolism, just like a dream. So if you have a dream, or if I have a dream, and we have this wacky, vivid dream, and there's all these different elements in the dream, when we wake up, we do not make the assumption that the dream was real. We may, however, come to believe that the dream was significant in that information was relayed to us in the dream.
Right.
In other words, and that information is necessarily symbolic because it wasn't happening in time and space, rather it was perceptual. In that case, during the dream state as we were sleeping. Well, the same thing can be said of someone who's having a visionary experience. No one else around them is seeing what they're seeing. Their perception is being engaged by something else, and the purpose of it within the biblical context is to relay information, and that information is packaged. It's packaged in symbolism. It's esoteric. I always like to refer to it as it's like a download of a zipped folder on a computer. It has to be decrypted. It's an encrypted folder, it's zipped. It has to be unzipped, and then once it's correctly unzipped, the data can be extracted,
right,
and the information properly conveyed. So when you have someone like Ezekiel who is seeing visions of heaven, and he's seeing cherubim, and he's seeing the wheels, and he's seeing all of the different things that are described in that particular event, what he is seeing is symbols and symbolism.
I don't know why I always thought, I see that point too, but I always thought it also could have been that through the dream, God was showing him literal things. Why take the interpretation that it's symbolism over it being a literal vision?
Because it's a message, because the purpose of prophecy is to deliver a message.
Right.
And that's the purpose of it. It's never just to show you something so that you can be fascinated with it. It's to give you the symbols that can be interpreted, and the message can therefore be understood. And this is one of the things that is so genius about the biblical texts, especially the prophetic content, is that there is so much of it that is encrypted, and when you begin to decrypt it, it's really extraordinary. For example, the cherubim. This would be another iconographic prophetic element that comes up quite a bit in the visionary experience of the prophets in the Old Testament. They see cherubim,
right,
and cherubim are described in two different ways. It's not always the same thing. There's two different ways. One of the ways that they're described is a composite, and in both ways they're described like this, but in varying ways. So one of the ways is a composite of four creatures. It's got the head of a man, it's got the body or the four parts of a lion, the hind parts of an ox, and the wings of an eagle. So it's a composite of four creatures. Well, the same thing is represented in the visions of cherubim with four faces.
right.
So rather than being a composite of these four beings in their body, they're these creatures, these four living creatures with four faces, or living creatures with four faces. It's the same thing. It's the face of a man, the face of an eagle, the face of a lion, and the face of an ox. Mm-hmm. And for so many years, I grew up as a Christian. My father was a pastor. And for so many years, I have always been given the explanation that these are literal beings that are in heaven, and that the purpose of showing us these beings is what? Is to fascinate our hearts, is something that I've heard over the years, is to just give us an anatomical lesson about these creatures that are around the throne. By the way, these are throne guardians, and the cherubim are not exclusive to the Hebrew culture. This is a feature of the ancient Near East. This is an iconographic feature of the ancient Near East in general. That means you find it in Mesopotamia, you find it in Egypt. And it's always in the same context. It's a throne guardian, which is in fact the context of these visions or these dreams, prophetic content from the Old Testament. And the cherubim are directly, by the way, connected with the Ezekiel's wheel.
Right.
And when you think about this, that never made any sense to me, because I felt like if God is going to convey a message to mankind, if he's going to give this prophet a vision, there's more going on here than an anatomical lesson about this creature. There's something here. This is obviously very esoteric. And the fact that it's described in two different ways, this composited being is described in two different ways, is indicating that this is a riddle that needs to be solved. This is a paradox. Mm-hmm. And so it wasn't until I encountered the work of David Flynn that I realized that what we're looking at here in these four faces are the four cardinal directions of the zodiac. That's what they are.
Can
the face of a man is Aquarius. The face of the eagle is Scorpio, because Scorpio has a dual aspect, a scorpion and an eagle.
Right.
The face of the lion is Leo, and the face of the ox is Taurus. And those are the four cardinal directions of the zodiac. And those faces are looking, each face in a different direction, north, south, east, and west. And they correspond to the zodiac. And the zodiac is time. That is a celestial timepiece that was understood by many ancient cultures and is exceedingly important even in the biblical context. And I mean, we can go down.
Yeah, I was going to ask why.
Down that rabbit hole if you like. But the point is that I believe that the wheels are also in Ezekiel's vision. You have the cherubim and you have the wheels, and I think that the wheel represents the zodiac. And that what we're getting here is what part of the message that's being conveyed here, not entirely, but part of the message is that this has to do with what the ancients referred to as the great mill, the zodiac. And the zodiac is not some astrological mumbo-jumbo New Age thing. It is literally a timepiece. And it's based on the axial precession, the 23-degree tilt of the Earth, and that wobble that the Earth makes as it turns. And that wobble takes an exceedingly long time to complete one rotation. It takes approximately 26,000 years. And there's a lot of information in the biblical narrative that directly implicates the zodiac. And in other words, there is a message of time that's being conveyed here with the cherubim and the wheels, rather than a depiction of a flying craft and these strange beings that fly in the craft. I don't think that's the message. We encounter those beings flying in their craft in the narrative.
Right. What do you take away?
Earlier.
What do you take away from that message? If God is showing time through the zodiac, what are then readers, in your opinion, supposed to take away from it?
Oh, I don't know. I think that we have to. Here's the problem. I was always indirectly, let's say, unintentionally taught to approach the Bible from a Western Christian perspective.
Okay.
The problem is you cannot understand the
imagery or
the iconography of prophecy from a Western Christian perspective. You'll never correctly decode it.
Right.
And there's a lot of prophecies that are explicit. They tell you the meaning, right? But then there's other stuff that is not explicit, that has to be decoded, that has to be decrypted. And in order to decrypt those things, it uses symbolism, prophecy. God uses symbolism. He's talking to people who lived in the ancient Near East, in the Bronze Age, in the Iron Age, and the iconography is ubiquitous to that time and culture. Again, you find it among the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Persians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians. All of the cultures in the ancient Near East used the same iconography. And the symbolism was always the same, and it meant the same thing.
Right.
And so when we go and we say, well, what does this prophecy mean, or what does this mean? If we try and deduce the meaning from a Western perspective, we're going to get it wrong 100% of the time, unless the meaning is decoded for us in the text,
right,
which, again, happens quite often in the Old Testament. If the meaning is not explicitly decoded, that means it needs to be decrypted. It needs to be decoded. And the keys to understanding the symbols are apparent in the iconography of the ancient Near East.
Right. So since we're from the West, not a part of that culture, really not coming out of the history of those symbols, it's almost impossible for us to plug into that.
That's right. We've forgotten the meaning.
Right.
We've forgotten the meaning. And you see, symbols are communication through symbols. It's much better, much more efficient than communication through language. Language changes.
For sure.
Even the English language has changed dramatically in some ways.
Absolutely.
Since when I was a kid until now. There's things that don't mean the same thing anymore.
Yep.
There's slang. There's the way people use words differently.
Oh yeah.
But language changes over time. So if you're going to convey a message that is outside of time for all time, how do you do it?
Right. You
have to do it with symbols.
It's like looking at art, and you have to decode it. But it's
right.
obviously it's beyond just art. This is like a capital T truth in a symbol that will hopefully echo through the generations.
That's right. And people say, well, symbols change too. That's not true. Our interpretation of symbols changes, but the original meaning of the symbols remains the same.
And certain people can hijack symbols and change it. But this doesn't mean the symbol itself has changed. It's just that the people in
like the Nazi Party, for example.
Exactly where I was going with that. Yep.
Yeah. So a communication that is delivered in the language of symbols is it's ingenious.
Yeah.
And it is done with the explicit purpose of preserving the message into the future.
Right.
And so what we've been doing, I think, as Western Christians for so long is trying to interpret the title of the encrypted folder. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
so
but we're not opening it up.
An encrypted folder that has, my name and the date on it, and you receive that encrypted folder on through your email, and you put it on your desktop, you don't have the information yet. Right. You just have the package. Right. In order to extract the information that I'm trying to relay to you, you have to decrypt that folder. You have to extract the information, unzip that folder, and extract the information. And only when you do that correctly can you ascertain the meaning of the message that I'm trying to convey to you. That is the way that prophecy is designed. Unless the meaning is explicitly explained, then we can assume that it's encrypted.
Right. No, that makes perfect sense. I haven't really thought about it that deeply before, like that, in terms of symbols and their importance and their shelf life. Because obviously, the way you put it now, has a much longer shelf life than language. And just in our lifetime, I'm 39, I've watched language die. Like the way we manipulate words today and redefine, it's almost like we're living in separate dimensions with people who are using the same words, but completely rooted in a different meaning. So the way we got here, and I'm glad we did, was asking about the wheel within a wheel and your what you see as crafts in the Bible. What would you then point to in the Bible as being one of these crafts that you were talking about earlier?
Well, I would say that these are the chariots of Israel.
Right.
These are the chariots of Israel, the chariots of God, the chariots of fire. They're described in those with those various terms. And again, we can deduce when we read, for example, that an angel or angels were dispatched to pick up Elijah. They came and they landed, and Elisha cried out, who was with Elijah, cried out that, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. And Elijah embarks into this craft. The craft is never described.
Right.
There is no attempt to describe it. Elijah embarks into this craft and is taken up to heaven in a whirlwind.
Right.
Well, what you have here is a vehicle of conveyance. If we can, and I believe we are entitled to do this, if we can analyze this story as people living in the 21st century, we can extract the most relevant elements from the story if we're trying to deduce who these people are who are picking up Elijah, assuming that the story is historical. I believe it is. Then what we're looking at is beings who have landed some kind of a vehicle of conveyance into which Elijah embarks.
Right.
And then this craft lifts off the ground and alights into the sky. And that is enough information for me, again, as someone reading this in the 21st century, to say, oh, well, some kind of technological vehicle of conveyance, again, what I would describe as an advanced aerospace vehicle, landed, and Elijah got into it, and then it took off.
Right.
Now, that doesn't change the theology. It doesn't change the meaning of the story. It doesn't change anything. It just brings into focus something that perhaps was unable to be understood for many centuries.
Right. It's just a new angle, but looking at the same thing, and you're not taking away from it. Would you look any differently at something like the cloud that the Hebrews followed in the desert? Would you say that's something else, or is that just a cloud that God made?
As I said before, I would reserve the word supernatural for God,
Okay.
and specifically for the Father and His Son, His
Right.
preeminent Son, Jesus.
Right.
So that there is where I would apply the word supernatural. God, the maker of the universe, can do whatever He wants with it.
Right.
He can manipulate the fabric of time and space and do so easily.
Yeah.
And so as it pertains to things that are done by God, as opposed to things that are done by the messengers dispatched from the kingdom of heaven, I'm looking at when you talk about God Himself, then all bets are off.
Right.
Anything is possible. I mean, if this is again the architect of the universe, He can do whatever He wants.
Yeah, He can destroy
So
it and remake it.
So to answer your question, I don't know what that was. It could have been anything.
Right.
Could it have been some kind of a technological thing? Sure.
Right.
But it could have been, quote unquote, supernatural, because I will allow for that word in my own mind to be applied to things that are directly involving the Maker Himself.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Because I've been rereading Exodus recently while reading Birthright, and then now looking at it through the lens of what you've been saying. And like, oh, maybe the cloud just isn't a cloud. You know, maybe it's something else. It was an interesting thing to think about. And plus, Exodus is just filled with a ton of supernatural things. The rock, giving water, the Mount Sinai. There's so many beautiful images and things that happen in that book. But then you're talking about this kind of like it's taboo for a lot of Christians to think about the supernatural. I've experienced that a bunch. I'm down in Georgia talking to a bunch of Baptists about UFOs. And you say something in your book, a phrase that I really like, and I was hoping you can tell the listeners about it, and its consequences, Sunday school reductionism. I think that's very interesting.
Let me think for a minute. In my book, I use the phrase Sunday school reductionism, actually, when talking about the term supernatural, because it's so easy for us, and again, coming from a Christian perspective, it's so easy to reduce these things, these stories, these events to bedtime stories, to just quaint stories that are supernatural, and everything is supernatural. And when you do that, you lose you lose, I think, the explanatory power of better terms. And specifically, what I mean is that let's be specific to the UFO phenomenon. So the reason why so many Christians have a hard time, they struggle with the UFO phenomenon, is because they cannot contemplate a situation in which you have beings who are manufacturing and deploying advanced technology in the same way that we do, but that are not us. Right. They have a hard time understanding that because they're not used to approaching the biblical narrative in that way, right? From that angle. And the reason why I think that in Sunday school reductionism, I would associate that with what I would describe as a medieval perspective of the world. And a lot of Christians are stuck in a medieval perspective of the world. And from the medieval's perspective, there's only a few characters in the game. And this is something I had to deal with in my own. I had to modify my own paradigm, and continue to modify my own paradigm over the years when confronted with new realities and new information. And in the beginning, I realized that I was hamstrung with this medieval perception of the world that I thought was biblically accurate. And indeed, I felt I was constrained as a Christian through the biblical lens, viewing the world through the biblical lens, to think in the following terms. So normally, I would say, I'll use the word conventionally. We are, I don't want to say taught. We're not taught. It's not that we're taught. It's not that we're indoctrinated. It's just a product of being Western Christians and
inheriting
and
maybe?
Having an unsophisticated view, I think, of what the Bible really is. We come to this understanding, let's call it, that there are basically four characters in the universe. There's, of course, God, who's at the top of the hierarchy. So he's at the top of the pyramid. He's the supreme being, okay? Then you have angels. They're under God. They're his messengers. Then you have demons, including fallen angels and all of that. And then you have mankind. That's it. 4 characters in the game.
Right.
So in the vastness of the universe, there's 4 different kinds of beings. And again, God being at the pinnacle of this hierarchy. Well, I came to realize at some point that was absurd.
Look around. I mean, look around this earth alone,
it has
right?
To be.
Yeah.
I believe that I mean, and when I started thinking about this, and it was quite an apropos environment to be contemplating this, I recall I was 19 years old at the time. I'm deep in the Amazon jungle. I'm standing by, I'm in the middle of nowhere, in the wilderness, by myself. I was staying with a hunter friend of mine in the jungle, and he went out to hunt, and I, in this particular occasion, stayed back in the camp, and I was sitting by this river called Sarah in English, and I'm sitting there contemplating this, and I'm surrounded in this effusion of life in the Amazon. Just everywhere you look, something is moving. It's just life everywhere, and half of it wants to eat you. But there's this life everywhere that's just, you're surrounded in a sea of foliage and all of the creatures and the sounds. It's never silent in the Amazon, and I was just sitting there thinking about this profusion of life that exists in that environment, in that tropical environment in the Amazon jungle. And it got me to wondering, this is a fingerprint of the Maker. I mean, if you believe in God, and particularly if you're coming at this from a Christian perspective, then you look at the earth, you look at the vast profusion of life, of organic life on earth. That's the fingerprint of the Maker.
Totally.
He didn't make 1 or 2 or 3 different kinds of things. He made millions
maximum creation
of different kinds of things. A vast profusion of life, a variegated life of all forms and all kinds. Some of that life, and if you think about it as a spectrum of consciousness, some of that life is over here on the lower end of the spectrum. Let's talk about this for a moment. So you have the spectrum of consciousness. Over here you have like an amoeba on this end, right? A single cell organism, like the simplest form of life. And then at the other end of the spectrum you have God, the most supreme intelligence, sentience that we can't even imagine. He's beyond our comprehension. That's the far end of the spectrum, you know. And human beings were somewhere over here, and angels are somewhere over here, and then behind us would be your great apes and your elephants and your dolphins and your whales and all of these other creatures. Dogs are somewhere in here, pigs that have a level of intelligence and perhaps even sentience that is such that we can interact and that we can have empathy for these animals, and they can interact with us, and you can form bonds, right?
Yeah.
But we can't form bonds with an amoeba, right? Because it's just not on the same level. It doesn't have the same level of sentience. Again, it's not close enough to us on this spectrum of consciousness for us to be able to interact with it on that level. And I think about just the earth in this regard, and it seems to me, and I'm going to use this word again, absurd, inconceivable, that when we look out into outer space, there's nothing out there.
Right. It's almost
there's no other life out there.
Further along the spectrum you created right there, closer to God, or maybe closer to us, but on the way towards God, would be things not like amoebas, but things that don't interact, or we can't at least interact with. We can't see, like we can't have a relationship with them the same way the amoeba can't have a relationship with us. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Right. And we just can't see.
I'm saying that even here on Earth, we have creatures like elephants and great apes and things that are not us, are not as, I would say, extraordinary as we are. We can do things that none of these other animals do. We, for example, we have this innate desire to bring order to chaos. No other animal does this. No other creature on planet Earth does this. No other creature will organize their cage in any meaningful way, the way that we do it, with the same level of capacity, certainly, in which we're meticulous and we do it in a very what seems to us to be a very logical way. Yeah. We're the only ones who bring order to chaos on Earth. And so we are of a higher sentience than these other creatures. Well, we're not the only sentient beings in the universe. We've already mentioned that there's these things called angels, these angelic beings, the elder race. They are also sentient in the way that we are sentient. And by the way, this ties into the image of God and all of that. But it just seems, as I said before, inconceivable to me that we look at the profusion of life on planet Earth, we see the fingerprint of God, but yet we don't project that same kind of, what would I say?
Like magnitude or
level of analysis when we look out into the universe. For me, it's very simple. I look at the Earth. If God made this place, then this isn't the only place he made like this.
Right. So
that's, to me, a very simple deduction.
Oh, yeah.
Because we know that there are sentient beings living somewhere else in this place called the kingdom of heaven. They're coming from this place. And this place, by the way, it constitutes a civilization. It has judges and courts and courtiers and it has a royal court and a judicial court. It has a standing army. I mean, it's a civilization.
Right.
And so this place exists. I believe that the kingdom of heaven has locality. In other words, it exists somewhere in the universe, maybe at the center of the universe. And that there are other places in the universe where life abounds. And this does not change at all the gospel of Jesus Christ. It doesn't change the narrative of the scriptures. It does not change the implications of anything. We're just hamstrung with a medieval perspective, with a medieval perception of let's say of the biblical narrative of the Judeo-Christian faith. And for whatever reason, so many people have gotten stuck there and have a hard time contemplating anything else. And so, having laid that foundation, now we can fast forward and we can think about what we were talking about, this idea with UFOs and who the pilots are and all of that. So for me, it's easy. I extrapolate out this idea that there is a kingdom of heaven, that in this kingdom they're doing things that are very similar to what we do on earth. Indeed, our systems of government are at some level a shadow of theirs, that we didn't invent civilization, we inherited it.
Right.
And so this stuff is going on somewhere else. And it was going on in that place first. In other words, what we call governance and civilization, this isn't the first place it happened.
Right. We're modeling it, inheriting it.
That seems to be a biblical fact.
When you say so this reductionism and this mindset we've been stuck in since the medieval age, do you think this is on purpose to divorce people from the magnitude of life outside just, what you were saying with people thinking it's more human-centric universe? Or is it a byproduct of just bad teaching? Like, why do you think that's happening? And why are we stuck in it, in your opinion?
My answer to this might be a bit complex. I think that there's two ways to approach the Bible. And this isn't the Bible, this is my book, but let's say this is the Bible.
Right.
There's two ways that you can hold this book in your hand. Again, pretending this is the Bible, not my book. One way is you can hold it and revere it and engage with it as a relic, a holy relic. And from this interpretation, there are norms and traditions that must be followed, because this is what you're holding in your hand is a relic, right? And I struggle with a more comprehensive way to explain that. But on the other hand, you can approach the scriptures not as a relic, but as a message, as an integrated message system. And the primary purpose of the Bible is to convey a message, a series of messages, but specifically there's a primary message. And the primary message of the Bible, not the only message, but the primary message is the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Right.
That's the primary message. And that is the message. That's why when Jesus was walking on the road of Emmaus with those two gentlemen post-resurrection, after he resurrected from the dead, He was going through the scriptures with them, astounding them with his knowledge and wisdom and insight, and he was demonstrating to them how all of these things pertain to him.
Right. It all pointed towards
him,
right.
to Christ, to the Son of God.
Yep.
So I approach the scriptures as a integrated message system. And so I'm looking for the message. I want to get the memo. I want to.
Right.
I want to discern the message and messages that are encrypted in this book. Again, pretending this is the Bible here. But if you approach it as a relic, in my mind, it's quite a different approach. You revere it. You take it as holy, and you are going to, in this view, lock yourself into particular traditional views,
Right.
based on whatever doctrine you subscribe to, whatever denomination rather you subscribe to. I mean, fundamental evangelicals have very different doctrinal positions on things in the same book as Greek Orthodox Christians or as Roman Catholics.
Yep.
And among Protestants, there are thousands of denominations. And everybody gets stuck on a particular thing, and then they build a stronghold. They build a habitation around particular doctrinal points, and they're approaching it like a relic.
Yeah.
And I don't know if this is making sense to
Totally.
anybody, but this is how I see it in my mind. But rather, I am looking for the message. That's all I care about. And a good illustration of this is when Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God, is walking in Judea. He's walking on earth and interacting with human beings. And according to the scriptures, according to the writers of the New Testament, the universe itself came into being through him.
Right.
That all things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things,
Right.
and in him all things consist. And he's walking in the flesh with us. He is literally the fulfillment of so much of the Old Testament. All of the things, even the artifacts of the temple and of the tabernacle point to him. The sacrifices and the feast days and all of that in the Old Testament, all of that very complicated ritualistic stuff. And this is one of the things, by the way, that distinguishes the Bible from other ancient documents, because other traditions have sacrifices and feast days and all of that. But in the Christian faith, all of those things are symbolic of a historical figure.
Yeah.
Who was the culmination of all of the symbolism, the fulfillment of so much of the prophecy in the flesh, walking on earth. And he is engaging so much with the priest class, with the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the teachers of the law, who many of them would have committed much of the Old Testament to memory, and they couldn't recognize him.
Right. Yep.
They didn't get
They were blaspheming
They
God.
could not decrypt that folder. They could not decode the information correctly so that they could see the fulfillment and the culmination of that information standing in front of them, conversing with them, because they approached the scriptures as a relic,
Right.
and they did not receive the message.
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, what you're saying is there's the school of thought that's a passive reading of the relic, and it's surface, but there's still a little more beneath the surface to that. But then there's also the active understanding of a relic and trying to decode a much deeper message that's in there beyond just.
You're looking for the message. It's an integrated message system. Now, if you walk away, I know that if someone takes the Bible and they read it and they walk away with any kind of message that is contrary to the gospel of Christ. And what is the gospel of Christ? It's exactly what Jesus declared when he walked on the earth. It's who he is and his mission and what he did. And then that gospel is reiterated by the apostles, that Jesus Christ came in the flesh, he died on the cross, he was buried, and then he was risen from the dead and ascended to the Father and so forth. If you walk away with any other message other than that, if you miss that message, then you've missed the entirety of the whole thing.
Oh yeah.
Like it has And in some ways, if you think about the Pharisees and Sadducees and teachers of the law, their lifetime pursuit of reading the scriptures and studying and memorizing amounted to nothing.
Right. I mean,
Nothing.
look at because they're memorizing something like, we'll say, the Ten Commandments, and then on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is expanding on what it means to murder, right? Like, it's not just a static reading or surface level thing. There's like, he's saying, no, it's not just that. It's like what's in your heart and stuff like that. And
Well, I say it meant nothing. It meant nothing to them in the final equation because they didn't get the message.
right.
So they understood the feast days, and they understood and they understood all of the traditions of the Jews, and they understood all of the artifacts in the temple and all of the traditions and all of the prophets. They understood all of it and revered it.
Yep.
From the perspective of a Jew, but they missed the very Son of God standing in their midst. They could not recognize him.
Right.
And so that's why when I say I approach the Bible as an integrated message, I'm looking for that communication from God outside of time, for all time, to mankind. And the Bible doesn't just address mankind, by the way. There are many verses that seem to be addressing members of the elder race as well. So that would be the distinction. And I don't know if that makes sense to people, but I don't view the Bible as a relic. I view it as a message, as an integrated message system. So I'm looking for the message.
Right.
And I think when you approach the Bible that way, first and foremost, if you do so honestly, and you do so in an unbiased way, you are going to receive the message of the gospel of Christ, and it is going to wreck your heart.
Right.
That's what it does. It's going to hit you like a hammer because it is so profound, and the narrative is crafted in such an ingenious way that by the time you get to Jesus of Nazareth, the fulfillment of all those things pertaining to him is spectacular. It's fulfilled in a spectacular way, and it becomes very powerfully convincing to someone who reads the Bible from a very honest, open, and unbiased way.
Oh yeah, it's the greatest collection of stories ever written. And every time I could reread something, every time I reread it, I'm seeing something new. It's unbelievable. So to shift gears a bit, I'm kind of thinking about that spectrum you created, the things that may or may not populate this earth. Where do demons fall in on this earth for you?
So when we talk about when we want to start to categorize, when we're looking at the taxonomy of beings in the biblical narrative, we run into two problems here. Well, we run into a primary problem. We do it most often from a Western perspective. We're going back to that reductionism and that medieval perspective.
Yep.
And we're dealing with symbols and words that we don't understand.
Right.
But so in order to, if we're going to say what is a demon, for example, in order to answer that question correctly in context, you have to go back to the traditions of the Hebrews. And if you answer that question there, it becomes very specific. Whereas in the West, we take the term demon and it's very amorphous. It's an ambiguous term.
Oh yeah.
It pretty much refers to anything that is what we would say demonic, anything that's grotesque or scary or menacing, demonic. Something we don't understand, vampires and boogeymen and gnomes and whatever else kind of creatures existed in the medieval mind back back during those times. We still hold on to that for whatever reason. That's our Western perspective of what a demon is. But if you drill down in the text, in the biblical text, and you inquire what specifically is a demon to the Hebrew mind. What is a demon? You get a very high resolution specific answer. And so when people ask me about demons and what about demons and aliens and whatever, the only answer that I can give is to resort to this refined understanding of these terms in the narrative. Mm-hmm. So a demon, according to within the realm of Hebrew cosmology, a demon is a very specific thing. In the New Testament, let's start there first, it's what's called an unclean spirit. It's the possessing spirit that inhabits the bodies of human beings. These are the ones that Jesus is encountering. They're foaming from the mouth. They're having epileptic fits.
Legion.
And so forth. They're uncontrollable. They're feral.
Yep.
Now, that itself has an origin. And the origin of this phenomenon, demon possession, goes back to an extra-biblical text called the Book of Enoch, specifically First Enoch, because you're not going to find the origin of those things in the Hebrew Old Testament. But you're going to find references to First Enoch mm-hmm. in the Bible. I would say definitely in the New Testament, and I would also say in the Old Testament, like Genesis 6, which are making reference to this other manuscript that existed, certainly story that existed among the ancient Hebrews, namely the Enochian tale, which describes a scenario in which a renegade group of watchers, of these angelic beings, descend to the earth in defiance of God. They descend specifically on the summit of Mount Hermon. They choose wives for themselves from among the daughters of men. They copulate with these women who conceive and give birth to giants.
Yep.
So you have this non-human species, these watchers who are mating with a human species, specifically these human women, and they are progenerating a race of hybrid giants, beings that are not fully human or fully angelic. They're somewhere in between. They're an unsanctioned hybrid race. Mm-hmm. And in the narrative of Enoch, First Enoch, specifically in the Book of the Watchers, at the end of that story, you have God is pronouncing judgment over the Watchers. He's pronouncing judgment over the Watchers and over their offspring, the Nephilim. Yep. And as part of the judgment over the Nephilim, they are condemned to a very unnatural condition. It's a curse that's placed on them. And the curse is, it's a situation in which when the Nephilim die in the post-flood context, pre-flood context rather, when they died, their spirits, their souls would persist in the world as vagabond wraiths. In other words, they would be disembodied spirits that would continue to live in this unnatural, torturous state because they would have all of the desires of the flesh, but no flesh with which to fulfill those desires. They would be hungry and thirsty and ravenous, probably have all of the same sexual impulses, all of the desires of the flesh, but without any flesh mm-hmm. through which to fulfill those desires. That's the curse of the Nephilim. Yeah. And in fact, in Enoch, in the pronouncement, in this judgment, it's said to them, you will be called evil spirits on the earth. Evil spirits have proceeded from your bodies, and you will be called evil spirits or unclean spirits on the earth. Again, with all of the desires of the flesh, but with no flesh through which to fulfill these desires. So what do these evil spirits seek? Bodies. They seek bodies to inhabit so that they can inhabit flesh, and through that flesh, attempt to satiate the desires of the flesh that they're still strapped with as a result of this curse. So you find this is a very specific categorization of entities in the biblical context, in Hebrew cosmology. Demons specifically refer to these unclean spirits, to these disembodied spirits that came from the Nephilim in the pre-flood world that proceeded from the dead Nephilim, the dead giants. As crazy as that sounds, as fantastical as that sounds, that is what the demons were.
Right.
They weren't just whatever grotesque thing, whatever kind of scary, spooky thing. Those weren't demons in the Hebrew cosmology. So that's why when people ask me, for example, the question that I think I can probably anticipate, are aliens demons? And I get this question all the time. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a difficult question to answer. Well, I can answer it very definitively, no. But it's a difficult question to answer in a way that's understandable to people coming from a Western Christian view, because we think demons are just whatever.
Right. Like it's a catch-all phrase for
whatever menacing, grotesque creature, fairy tale creature. That's all demons, and the alien seems to fit that category. Therefore, aliens are demons. Well, that's not true. And when you do that, when you categorize like a gray alien in that way, what you do is you've robbed yourself of any deeper understanding of what this creature might be.
Right. It goes against what you're saying
and
about...
you're being inaccurate also in regard to the Hebrew cosmology, because like a gray alien specifically doesn't have any of the attributes of a disembodied spirit. In fact, it's antithetical in regard to its characteristics, its personality traits, if we can call them that. It's totally antithetical, the opposite of what demons are in the New Testament.
So would you say that what is possessing the "We Are Legion" scene with Jesus is the consequence of the evil, unclean spirits of the Nephilim?
I'm sorry, what's possessing Legion?
Like Legion, are the things that are inside the Legion, is that from the Nephilim? Yeah. In your opinion?
Definitely. And specifically, actually, it's you cannot understand that story and it's the impact of that story, the implication of that story without having First Enoch in view, because Jesus is in the land of Gadara. He disembarks from the boat. He's in the land of Gadara, and he's approached by, depending on which gospel you're reading, either one guy or two guys that are inhabited by this legion of demons. And in fact, they call themselves Legion because we are many. And they come and they throw themselves at Jesus' feet. And they say to him, "We know who you are, you Son of God. Why have you come to torment us before the time?" Mm-hmm. And what in the world are they talking about? What time are they talking? What's the time? Well, if you go back to First Enoch, to the story I just referenced, as God is pronouncing this terrible curse over the spirits of the Nephilim, the souls of the Nephilim that would persist in the world as disembodied vagabond wraiths, he says that they would persist in this condition until the age is wholly consummated, until the judgment at the end of the age. And so there's something that's going to happen at the end of the age that's prophesied in the Book of Enoch, and then it's prophesied in the oracles of Enoch and in the oracles of the prophets in the Old Testament. It's this event, this great judgment that's going to take place, and there's a judge, a specific person who's going to judge the living and the dead, and that person is the Son of God, Jesus of Nazareth. And so you have the great judge, Jesus of Nazareth, walking in Gadara, and this legion of demons recognizes who he is, and they run to him, throw themselves at his feet, and basically say, "It's not time yet. What are you doing here?
I think
the time hasn't come yet. The age has not been fully consummated. The day of judgment has not yet come, but yet you are here. What are you doing here? Have you come to torment us before that time?"
I think it's in your book that you say the demons are the first to really recognize the Son of God on earth, right?
They recognize him, and Jesus does not permit them to say who he is.
Right.
Because they recognize who he is.
Right.
And the testimony of Jesus was not supposed to come from the mouth of demons.
Right. But they just
through the works that Jesus performed in accordance with the scriptures. So it's very interesting because they knew who he was. They knew exactly who he was. This was the great judge. This was the Son of Man, as depicted in the oracles of Enoch. This is the Son of Man, not a Son of Man, the Son of Man, the great judge who would judge the living and the dead, and ultimately vanquish all of the powers of darkness that were still freely roaming the earth. And it's incredible. I mean, if you don't have that backstory in view, you can't truly understand, again, as I said earlier, the implications of what are going on in the Gadarene demoniac. And it's also important to back up and recognize that from this perspective, within Hebrew cosmology, these demons have one desire, and that is to inhabit flesh and inflict on that flesh all of their anger and all of their resentment and toward mankind. And that's why people who are demon-possessed often are not only ravenous, are not only foaming from the mouth and demonic in every way, they also inflict injury on the body of the host. And so that's the demon specific thing that we call a demon from it within the context of Hebrew cosmology. And if you're going to then go out into the world and label this, that, or other as a demon within the context of the Bible, then you only get to do so using this very narrow understanding of what a demon is.
Right.
You don't get to go out there and plaster everything with the word demon, because it doesn't make any sense. It's not accurate, and you're never going to develop a more you're never going to develop a deeper understanding of phenomena that happens if that's the way you approach everything. And that's my problem when people say, well, aren't aliens just demons?
Right.
And because the answer is no. And again, you have to consider, the Gadarene demoniac, he was so stark raving mad, and he was inhumanly powerful, that they would chain him up. The villagers would chain him up in the tombs to try and control him. And he would howl all night in the tombs, and he would break the chains. He could not be restrained. So he wandered around like a vagabond, wandered around the countryside in this insane state of mind, with his inhuman power, being inhabited by all these demons. So people who are inhabited by demons are not calm and collected.
Right. Yeah.
Their disposition is, as I said, it's feral.
Yeah.
They're feral. They're not walking around all calm and collected. And specifically, whenever people ask me, isn't an alien a demon, or aren't aliens demons, they're usually envisioning in their minds the gray alien, the little 3.5 foot, 4 foot tall, gray alien with the large bulbous head, almond-shaped black eyes. That's what they're thinking. Aren't those just demons? Well, I always try and get people to think logically about this. You compare the Gadarene demoniac with a gray alien. If you know anything about gray aliens, if you've ever done that kind of research and read especially the abduction material, you will understand that these are very dispassionate, calm,
scientific,
unemotional creatures.
Yeah.
They're very robotic,
right?
Almost as if they don't have any free will. They're just very robotic. They don't display the slightest semblance of emotion ever, even when abductees are less than cooperative. They're never angry. They have no emotion. So you tell me. I mean, if aren't gray aliens demons? Well, let's just do a 1-to-1 comparison: the Gadarene demoniac and a gray alien.
Right.
The answer is no. This is something else. And so if you have a broader perspective, a much more expansive paradigm, then you could simply say, well, maybe this is something else that is coming from somewhere else. Could be coming from on the earth. Maybe it's some sort of sentient being that's inhabiting the earth in a let's say a crypto-terrestrial creature inhabiting the earth, or it's coming from somewhere else, and we're not the only sentient beings in the universe.
Could we say that some aliens might be demonic and some are good?
Demonic is a different term. Again, we have to define terms because we're coming at this from a Western Christian perspective. So demonic would mean, in our parlance, would mean anything that is evil, malevolent.
Right.
It invokes supernaturalism, but not necessarily so. But anything that's evil, a person can be demonic, even if they're not inhabited by demons. They can be demonic in that they are acting in a malevolent way, like demons. So if you ask me now, that's a different question. Are, let's be specific, gray aliens demonic? My answer would be yes, based on what they're doing.
Right.
What they're doing is nefarious. So,
For sure.
so that's a different question. So I would say no, aliens are not demons. Yes, they are demonic.
Yeah, that's good. And also thinking of aliens as demons goes against what you're saying earlier about this spectrum of entities. And there's so many different things. So it's more of the reductionist language to just label everything that might be supernatural to you as one thing,
Correct.
which then lessens the magnitude, infinite power of God. So that's a good point. So then,
and much more interesting possibilities as well.
oh yeah, many, many more. While I was reading your book, you're talking about early Earth being destroyed. I guess this would be pre-Adam, formless chaos, and I'm thinking of Greek mythology that has very similar language. How do you square those old stories? People always say, oh, that's the Bible's based on this. How do you square that timeline of stories and myth with what's in the Bible and what's in these other stories?
It's irrelevant to me.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter to me which came first, the Babylonian epic or the Bible, or the Sumerian epic or Sumerian flood epic and the Bible. Irrelevant, because all that I want to know is the story true? And if the story is true, then they're both drawing on. They could both be drawing on the same story.
Yep.
And this story would be coming from, if the story is true, and I believe it is, and I'm referencing the flood narrative in the Bible. If the story is true, then the origins of the story aren't Sumer. They're not Acadia. They're not Babylon. They're not ancient Egypt. They're antediluvian. The origin would be antediluvian. And let's go further. If the Book of Enoch, if any portion of the Book of Enoch is true, and by the way, I believe that the earliest portions of the Book of Enoch are reliable, namely the Book of the Watchers and the Book of Parables. The latter portions of First Enoch are written after Christ and are less reliable and are the product probably of Merkaba chariot mysticism. So for those who are wondering about the Book of Enoch. So if the narrative of Enoch is true, if the Noahic flood story is true from the Bible, and the Sumerians and the ancient Egyptians are keeping similar flood myths, that tells me that rather than say, oh, the Bible's just based on those, no, they're all drawing from the same original story. Right. It's antediluvian. It predates all of them. The question is, which account is more faithful to the story? And that depends on how you view this. If, and this kind of, I mean, this, I don't know how I would condense what I'm about to say here without going on and on and on. But if the biblical narrative is true, and again, I believe it is, if the biblical narrative is true and more true than the Sumerian flood myth, there would be a reason for that, and the Bible gives you the answer for the reason for that. Because after the flood, of course, you have Noah and his sons. They're repopulating the earth, or at least that region of the earth. They are, by the way, according to the Bible, Noah and his sons, his three sons, are the origin of all of those early Mesopotamian civilizations. So who came first, Noah or the Sumerians? Noah came first.
Right.
So they came out of, we might call it the Noahic culture, which would have been the antediluvian culture, came from Noah and his offspring. And Noah might have been certainly would have been relaying these stories. Maybe he had it in written form. Maybe he even had First Enoch in his hands. It would have been called something else. But maybe he would have had a manuscript written by his ancestor Enoch in his hands that he preserved from the flood. And that story would have been faithfully committed to his offspring until rebellion happens. And that rebellion is evident in the narrative after the flood. What do we get?
Babel?
The Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
We get the Tower of Babel. We get a rebellion that happens. And we know it's a rebellion because it's in direct contradiction. God tells them to disperse, to fill the earth, to repopulate the earth after the flood. And what do? They come together in direct defiance of God, and they decide they're going to build a city, in the midst of which will be this tower. The city is called Babel, the gate of the gods, and the tower is called the Tower of Babel. And this is an act of insurrection against God. So suddenly we have a rebellion formulating in the plains of Shinar in Mesopotamia that is in direct defiance of the God of Noah. And so if you have these flood myths, rather, if you have an accounting, a historical accounting coming through Noah, that story is going to get bastardized by the rebels.
Right.
It's going to change the characters. It's going to take the story of this cataclysm that nobody's going to forget about, and it's going to change it, modify it in such a way that it makes God the enemy, or it appeals to a new religious system.
Right.
So there's a very easy explanation for this. So that's why I say it's irrelevant if the Sumerian flood myth came first or if the Egyptian flood myth came first. Obviously, Sumerian and Akkadian and the Mesopotamian culture at large came before Hebrew culture. There's no disputing that. Abraham himself was from Mesopotamia. Hebrew culture, to some extent, is Mesopotamian. So obviously, you're going to have a lot of the same you're going to have similar features in the stories and in all of that, and also you're going to have there's in regard to a counter narrative against the one that was the result of the Babel incident. You would have a polemic against that, trying to return people to the original story from Noah. That was certainly, as I said, perpetuated through Noah, and that would be, in this worldview, that would be the Hebrew narrative correcting the record.
Right.
So that is a very, that is certainly within the realm of possibility, and I think it's an aspect that a lot of people they don't think about. They don't consider this scenario. They just say, which one's older? Yeah. If the Sumerian flood myth is older, that means the Bible was just a plagiarization of the Sumerian flood myth. That's a very low resolution analysis right there. Oh, very, very low resolution.
You hear it a lot from people who just want to cheaply subvert the narrative of the Bible by thinking that they can do that. But the way you're saying it almost gives all these stories give more credence to the story, like the flood story.
What if the Book of Enoch is the original narrative? What if Enoch, whatever manuscript Enoch wrote, let's assume Enoch was a historical character. Right. He wrote something consistent, generally consistent with First Enoch. What if that's the original story?
Right.
That would mean then that the Sumerian story is an aberration, is a bastardization of the original document. Yeah. Which was written long before the Sumerian culture existed.
I don't know much about why Enoch is left out. This is all still fairly new to me, but it seems interesting. Like, I believe it's Ethiopia; they still have it in their Bible, but other cultures decided we're just not going to do this.
Well, the Book of Enoch is a very complicated topic. First Enoch, there's three versions: first, second, third. The second and third versions, one's a Slavonic version, and then one's a Hebrew version. They are different traditions. First Enoch, the earliest sections of First Enoch, again, namely the Book of the Watchers and the Book of Parables, are unquestionably written before the birth of Christ. And probably, in my estimation, they come from a tradition, or those very manuscripts might even go all the way back to the antediluvian world, which would make them one, if not the earliest manuscripts that we have. Now, of course, that can be disputed all day long, but it's a possibility. Enoch is I call it the Enochian tale. Now, let's be careful, because I separate the Book of the Watchers and the Book of Parables, the earliest sections of Enoch, from the sections that come after, like the course of the heavenly luminaries and the dream visions and the other material in First Enoch. I put those in a different category because they're written after Christ. And what's remarkable is that the parables specifically contain all kinds of oracles in them pertaining to the Messiah. Right. And they're very specific. And they're just as remarkable, some of them, if not more remarkable, than the oracles pertaining to Christ in the Old Testament. Jesus, for example, refers to himself as the Son of Man more often than any other title. And he had a handful of titles to choose from the Old Testament. He refers to himself as the Son of Man. And we think that he's, and I say we, the conventional Christian thought is that he refers to himself as the Son of Man because of a reference in the book of Daniel, where Daniel sees one like a son of man. That's not a definitive title. Mm-hmm. That's a description of somebody who looks like a human being.
Right.
One like a son of man and the Son of Man are two different things.
For sure.
Whereas the book of Enoch has oracles, prophecies, many, that are explicitly refer to the Son of Man, not one like a son of man, but a proper title, the Son of Man. And so when Jesus is using this particular epithet of himself, the Jews know exactly who he's claiming to be,
right?
Because they're conversant with the oracles of Enoch, and that is indisputable. The scribe class and the writers of the New Testament were conversant with the oracles of Enoch. James, the brother of Jesus, or rather Jude, writes the book, I think I got that right. James, I think, wrote the book of Jude, writes verbatim. He incorporates verbatim verses right out of the book of Enoch.
Right.
He doesn't summarize them. He doesn't truncate them. He literally takes verse for verse from First Enoch, the manuscript we have today. He takes it verse for verse and pastes it into that epistle,
giving it clear credence that it was a serious thing.
And so it's not only was the author of Jude conversant with Enoch, he literally quotes it verbatim.
Right.
And not only does he quote it verbatim, he says he refers to Enoch, the prophet, wrote, and then he incorporates it into his epistle. So that's pretty definitive. Then Peter references the story. He doesn't put a verse in there from First Enoch, but he directly references the story. And I believe that Genesis 6, the writer of Genesis 6, is referencing the book of Enoch when he writes in Genesis 6 that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were comely, and they decided to take wives from them. Yep. And then it talks about the Nephilim. That is a reference to a story that was well known among the Hebrews at the time, and for all time. It's what I call the Enochian tale. It's the story of Enoch, of First Enoch. And you find there are many, many, many more examples of this. In fact, I don't have it in front of me, but I actually published a book of Enoch. I wrote commentary and introduction to Enoch. I did it with Luke and Nate from the Blurry Creatures podcast.
That's right.
And in my introduction to Enoch, I go through this. I demonstrate how the writers of the New and Old Testament were conversant with the book of Enoch, with First Enoch. So I would go so far as to say that you cannot separate the Enochian narrative from either the Old Testament or New Testament of the Bible.
Right.
You cannot separate them.
You see it referenced in both clearly.
They are intermixed. The story of Enoch is interlaced through the Old and New Testament. And again, it's quoted verbatim by Jude. I misspoke in the beginning. Jude, who was one of Jesus's half-brothers, quotes Enoch verbatim in his epistle.
May I ask how your father, who I believe you said was a pastor, views some of these views that you have about the Bible? Is there any pushback or arguments there? I'm curious.
My father was a very good pastor, but he was very conventional in his thinking. Mm-hmm. I remember he passed away in 2020, and I published my book he might have passed away in 2021. I think he passed away in 2021. I published my book in 2020. He hadn't read my book, but he did hear me espousing my views on a couple of different interviews, and he was struggling with the same thing that a lot of people struggle with.
Right.
He could not understand, for example, the idea of aliens outside of what he would have considered to be the only option available to someone who adheres to the biblical text, demons.
Right.
So that was his worldview, and I never really bothered to argue with him about it. But
Right.
in fact, it was one of the last conversations that we had. He wanted
Really?
to talk about that before he died.
Oh, wow.
But it's very difficult for people because when you break that paradigm, rather, let me say that more accurately, when you are confronted with ideas that we've been talking about today, and you're willing to accept them, or at the very least, you're willing to consider them, what it does is it forces you to expand your paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
And that expansion is uncomfortable for people. It's not a good feeling. It's for many people, it's very uncomfortable because this paradigm that you have, this worldview that you've crafted, it's a comfort zone. And as long as things fit into that paradigm, you can make sense of the world.
Yeah.
But as soon as you realize that your paradigm is too constricting, too small, too limiting, and you have to forcibly expand it, it's very difficult for people.
Mm-hmm.
They have a hard time. They flounder. For me, it's exciting.
Yeah.
But for a lot of people, there's a conflict, and there's an internal conflict that goes along with that, primarily because of different doctrinal traditions and also denominational traditions. And so people are very reluctant to do that. And it also exposes our ignorance, all of us. Every time we realize that we don't have a big enough paradigm, it exposes our ignorance.
Yeah.
And that doesn't feel good.
Yep.
That's not a good feeling. But, ultimately, though, it's liberating.
I agree. I mean,
Because I absolutely, as people who listen to me know, I absolutely affirm, confess, declare the gospel of Jesus Christ, and it is the foundation of everything that I believe. I've been absolutely convinced, both in my mind and in my heart, that the gospel of Christ is true, that Jesus of Nazareth is precisely who he said he was, namely the Messiah, the Son of God. And that never changes. But everything else is in flux. For example,
right.
the possibility of extraterrestrial civilizations that are also in the game, so to speak, that it's not just these four characters that we mentioned earlier, that there might be an abundance of life in the universe. Mm-hmm. That at one time was inconceivable to me until I was forced to accept certain realities and allow for the expansion of my worldview. And it was a difficult process, but ultimately it's very fruitful and very satisfying.
So forgive me if this is a little too personal, and you don't have to answer if it is, but a lot of people who listen, including myself, they write into me, or I'm thinking about it, like raising your kids and what you tell them in terms of, the conventional way of looking at the Bible, but then everything that we're talking about outside of it. Like, do you at a certain age are going to get into it? Is it just from the beginning you get into it? Do you think about that with them?
My kids hear me talking about this stuff all the time. They hear me conversing. People come over and we'll sit there and have a cup of coffee at my kitchen table, and my kids will be listening to every word I'm saying. With my kids, when me and my wife, if we do a Bible study with our kids, we want to reinforce the things that are most important. Mm-hmm. And the things that are most important are not aliens and giants and all this kind of stuff that I always talk about, that I'm just very fascinated with and find entertaining. We reinforce the meaning of the gospel and how they ought to conduct themselves in the world and so forth. Those are the things that when I have an opportunity to sit down with my boys, I have 5 boys, those are the things that we focus on now. My kids ask me questions all the time about aliens and giants and stuff like that, and that's fun. And when they do, I answer them in a way that I feel is or I attempt to answer them in a way that is understandable, because some of the stuff is very deep and complex. But I feel like them growing up, having a foundation in the gospel of Christ, but having all of these other things floating around, I think they're going to have much less of a difficulty than I did dealing with certain realities. I mean,
Totally.
and when I say that, being confronted, for example, with the UFO phenomenon in the way that I've been confronted with it, and having people who were and are being abducted by gray aliens coming to me and telling me their stories and asking me for help and advice, and you have to confront these realities, and you have to if you're going to try and make sense of them at all, you have to do so in the most logical, open-minded way possible, or you're never going to gain any understanding into these complex topics.
Yep. It goes back to the active understanding you were talking about with the relic, the Bible. Well, that's a great answer. Timothy, I'm going to let you go. This has been a really incredible conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to hang with us. Where can people find you online? Where can they find your books?
My handle is always the same on social media, Timothy Alberino. My YouTube channel is Timothy Alberino. I'm on Instagram and X. I have a members community, the alberinoanalysis.com, where we go deep into these topics. There's a lot of great content. We're reviewing, actually, right now. We're on like the 7th installment of a review of David Flynn's book Cydonia, which is mind-blowing.
Okay, got to read it.
And my book Birthright is on Amazon, and my Book of Enoch is also on Amazon. If people are interested in the Book of Enoch, you can find both Birthright and Enoch on Amazon. And my version of the Book of Enoch has I provide commentary and an introduction, so you're going to get a little bit of a different. And we also have we put concept art in there,
awesome,
which is really cool.
That's awesome. So I highly recommend it. I love the way Birthright's written. The information is great. Thank you for writing it, man. Thank you for joining us, and hopefully we'll do this again soon.
I appreciate it. Anytime.
Cool, man. Have a good one. Bye.
You too.
Incredible.
Cool.
So much good
Fascinating
information. I'm serious, people. Birthright is a beautifully written book, but filled with a lot of really interesting information. I'm very much enjoying it. I hope people check it out and check out Timothy online, all his stuff.